Okay, well, we'll get started then at 6:31. So we likely have a few people joining along the way, and that's fine. We've got a speaker coming in at 7 or just a bit before 7. So we may have some people joining a little bit later too. So I apologize for the first two speakers or to the first two speakers for that. But just want to welcome everyone to Sheboygan County, League of Women Voters of Sheboygan County, our May member program. Program agenda will be quite short because we do have some very good speakers this time. I have a very short local update. Then we'll have an update on the People's Maps Commission from Commissioner Melissa Prentice. The Executive Director of the Wisconsin League of Women Voters will give us an update on what's going on at the state level. And then we've got a speaker starting around 7 o'clock who will be talking about how math corrodes democracy, but might still save it. So we'll get started then with our local updates. And I'm going to, rather than spend a lot of time on this, I'm going to ask you to look at our website and Facebook pages for our chapter updates. And I also want to remind everyone that we've got an annual meeting on July 21st, and watch your email and the website for more information on that. Part of that meeting will involve election of officers and directors. So we're also putting out a call to the membership for officers and directors. So if anybody wants to volunteer for open positions, just email the league. You can also email me or contact me by other means. And the email address is on the screen, but I'll remind you that's the one that you should be getting most of your league, local league emails from. So with that, I'm going to move on to our first speaker, Melissa Prentice. And many of you have heard from her before, but we do have a few guests on the line, so I'm going to give her a short introduction here. Melissa Prentice of Sheboygan is the librarian and public services manager for the city of Sheboygan at Mead Public Library. She has been involved with the League of Women Voters, the Wisconsin Library Association, and was the library representative for the City of Sheboygan DEIB initiative, working on diversity and inclusion. Melissa represents the 6th Congressional District on Wisconsin's People's Maps Commission. So Melissa, take it away, and you should be able to share your screen if you'd like. I also do have those handouts that you sent me earlier if you need.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much, Jane. And good evening, fellow leaguers. Thanks so much for inviting me back to speak to you about the work of the People's Maps Commission. I'm Melissa Prentice. I'm your 6th Congressional District Commissioner on the Maps Commission. And just a quick background for those of you who are maybe new and haven't heard from me yet. The People's Maps Commission was created by Governor Evers last year to provide a nonpartisan, citizen-driven redistricting solution committed to transparency and accountability. The 9 commissioners were selected by 3 retired judges from among over 200 applicants from across the state. Throughout the map developing process, we have held virtual hearings in each of Wisconsin's 8 congressional districts. And we have just recently adopted our map drawing criteria. So once we finished up with those hearings, we spent quite a bit of time working on that criteria document. I did share that with Jane. It's also available on the People's Maps Commission website. I'm going to share my screen just so that we can have that up while I'm speaking here. Okay. So I would encourage you all to take a closer look at this when you have some time, and absolutely do share your feedback with the commission. If there's anything you want us to know, this whole entire process really has been driven by a lot of the public comments that we've received. So that, as I said, the criteria were developed in response to the testimony of the experts and the citizens that we heard from in over 20 hours of hearings. We got written comments from over 1,000 Wisconsinites. And so, as I said, please take a look at this criteria document. This really is, I think, the best hope for redistricting in Wisconsin. And I'm confident that following this criteria will deliver fair maps in every scenario. And so what comes next for the commission? So as we wait on the 2020 census data, which we expect will be made available late this summer, we're turning our attention to the actual line drawing process, utilizing this criteria that we've created. I'm going to scroll down a bit so you can get a look at some of this criteria here. Okay. We're working very closely with Moon Duchin at the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group out of Tufts University to assist really specifically with identifying communities of interest. That's that second order group 2 criteria in the document. And at the MGGG, they've developed this really wonderful tool called Districtor that makes this process much easier, the process of drawing the maps, okay? So this communities of interest piece is really important, and it's another area where the citizens of Wisconsin can get involved in the map drawing process and have their voices heard. So a community of interest, if you're unfamiliar, is a geographic area or neighborhood contained within a contiguous area on a map where the residents share common interests and bonds that deserve consideration by elected officials. So that might be people with common economic, ethnic, cultural, or other bonds, whether that's environmental issues, transportation, or educational concerns. So those COIs represent common interests that are often linked to public policy. They're not designed at all to promote a particular party or candidate or jurisdiction, but really to make sure that people can vote as part of a community. And I think the way this really ties in for Sheboygonites is this concept of our city being split in half. And we're not a hugely populous metropolis. There's really no reason for that. I think it's justified to consider the city itself a community of interest that should not be split, that it's important for us as the city of Sheboygan to be able to have our interests heard by one representative and feel that isn't being split, okay? So as I mentioned, this communities of interest area is a part of the process where the citizens of Wisconsin can make their voices heard. So that I'm going to just toggle over to this flyer here from MGGG. And they have this great web-based mapping tool called Districtor. It's very easy to use. If you are familiar with how Google Maps works, it's pretty similar to that. They offer training sessions once a week. They will even schedule one-on-one or group sessions. If there's a few people in the league, for example, that want to get together and do one of these trainings, you can definitely do that by contacting the email on that flyer. And what the workshops will do is just give you the broad overview of how the tool works. And then you can work independently by yourself, or as I said, with a group from your community, and draw what you consider to be your community of interest. If you live in Sheboygan, in the city of Sheboygan, you might say that you want the whole city to be whole. You might say maybe the Sheboygan Area School District is a community of interest, and that's how you draw your maps. You might have ideas about how the county should be split or shouldn't. So for those of you who are out in Falls or Plymouth, you might have some ideas about what those districts should look like. So that's going to be a really important tool for us as we work through that line drawing process. So what we will do is, as a commission, we're going to be looking at that first order criteria. We're going to be, and those are very traditional redistricting principles: contiguity, compactness, and preserving political boundaries. And what's meant by that is wards, essentially. So we wouldn't be splitting wards in half. The next layer of criteria that we are looking at is those communities of interest. So once we have our initial lines drawn, we would be overlaying those maps submitted to us by the citizens of Wisconsin and making sure that our lines kind of match up with that and making adjustments as needed. So what comes next? I get asked this question a lot. How do I think this is all going to play out? So it very definitely will go to court. We're pretty certain of that. So traditionally how this process works is the legislature draws their own maps, and the governor then approves or vetoes them, and that's that. So we know that there is a contentious relationship between the governor and the legislature, and that they're not going to agree on the maps that are drawn. We also know that the legislature sees the commission as a sort of arm of the governor, even though we are not. We're entirely nonpartisan. We are volunteers. We're unpaid. We're not elected officials. But that perception is still there from the legislative side. So as I said, we expect there to be litigation on the maps, and there's a possibility because the time frame is going to be incredibly condensed. Like I said, we're going to be getting that census data at the end of the summer, and we expect that our maps and the legislature's maps will be turned around pretty quickly after that census data is out, and then it'll go to court. But the litigation needs to be complete by April of 2022. So that's a very short time frame. So there is a possibility that the courts themselves will just pick one set of maps, either the legislatures or the map commissions, and those would be then the new legislative and congressional districts for the state. So that's sort of where things stand right now. I know that was kind of a whirlwind info dump. So if you have questions and there's time, I'd be happy to answer those. And I will stop sharing my screen.
We do have a couple of minutes if anyone has some questions. Otherwise, you can get in touch with Melissa afterwards too. But oh, John has a question.
If now popular for particular assembly districts, for example, to draw those lines, those assembly districts are supposed to have close to equal populations, right?
Yes.
And how is that going to jive with trying to keep community of interest intact?
That's a great question. So it will be complicated to give you a succinct answer, but we do feel confident that we will be able to at least consider those things. So what the communities of interest will look like for us when we see them is what it will do is create kind of a fuzzy line around the existing districts. So we can kind of tweak those lines if we need to, but as you said, I mean, we are shooting for like a 1-person population deviation, which is tiny. So there's not going to be a ton of flexibility, but I think there are infinite ways to draw political districts. And that's something that we've been learning as we've been doing this training with the Districtor software. You can configure things in a lot of ways and still get that equal population distribution. So I'm confident that we can accommodate both of those criteria in a way that's satisfying to the citizens of the state.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. We'll move on then in the interest of time. I know Debra has some updates to give us as well. And if we have a little more time later, we can go through some more questions. I know, again, we've got some guests on the line here, so I'm going to give Debra an introduction. Some of you know her, some of you don't. Debra Cronmiller became Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin in January of 2020. Prior to that, she was president of the League's state board and held various other positions. She has been active with the League in Appleton and Dane counties as well. She also worked for the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families as its policy and automation section chief and as the executive director of a nonprofit homeless shelter. So I'll turn it over to you, Debra.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and a big heartfelt thank you to all of you League members in the Sheboygan area for all you do to support Wisconsin, to support the National League's agenda. We're all in this together, and it really does take all of us to have the impact that we are having. I want to let you know that we've been really busy in a number of key areas over the last year and a half. In the area Making Democracy Work, the national program, The State League has obviously been very busy with our work on elections. We've created a number of election reports in the last couple of years. Because we discontinued our election observation during COVID, we actually had to stand up a new tool, a survey, the voter experience survey, that literally, hundreds of people have responded to, and it has allowed us to make recommendations to the WEC to update their election administration processes during COVID, making elections safer, more accessible, more absentee ballot, the drop boxes, all of this was very much what we heard from people around the state and made those recommendations. We have been busy in the last weeks and months creating what is a DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles report. We have learned through our election observation and from all the work that the League has done that our elections are not equally accessible by all folks. Folks that do not possess a driver's license have a much more difficult time voting in Wisconsin. And we're creating a report that will be released actually next week to help everyone in Wisconsin understand that for the 27% of Wisconsin voters that do not possess a driver's license, we need to make changes at the DMV to ensure that they can get have access to voting IDs and make sure that the DMV itself is accessible, which is not always true in rural and many areas around the state. We have been working on the issue of jail voting. We have recognized that there are many individuals in this state who are incarcerated in jails and charged with crimes, some misdemeanors, some felony crimes, but they have not been adjudicated, and their right to vote has not been withdrawn from them. And they need to have access to the ballot if they're in jail on election day. And so we're working with leagues across the state right now to really help make sure that happens. We've obviously been producing the Vote 411 voter guides, and we will be producing a Vote 411 guide for the special election in the 37th that's being held this spring. The League will be active in trying to contact the 188,000 voters who have not voted in the last 4 years in any election. These voters will be removed from the voting rolls. And like we always do when there's any voter purging going on, we will try to intervene with those voters to encourage them to re-register and encourage them to be active in voting for voting in all elections and try to help them do that. We've obviously been very busy in the fair map space. In just recent months, we have had our Day of Action events. We stood up an email campaign. Over 5,000 emails were sent to elected officials in the state of Wisconsin, encouraging them to adopt, as Melissa was just talking about, nonpartisan, non-gerrymandered maps so that every voter's voice can be heard. We actually sent a press release out on April 29th, the Day of Action, holding up a decision made by the Supreme Court, Williams-Yulee versus the Florida Bar. This was actually a money in politics type of case. But anyway, Judge Roberts at the Supreme Court level ruled and opined in his opinion that unlike candidates for the executive branch or for the legislature, the judiciary is the independent branch of our government, and these justices or judges and judge candidates should not be soliciting contributions. They are not politicians. They are the independent branch of government. So it's a very significant case, and if we do end up in court, we want to make sure that any justices who hear cases on redistricting will be impartial and fair and support the laws and not the parties. We produced a lot of voting maps materials. We'll be sending a survey soon if you need more materials in your area. We've been involved in the fair court space. And we, this year, have stood up a new voter services committee that is really created a number of very tangible metrics. And Eileen Newcomer, our voter services manager on staff, has just released a new infographic that sort of summarizes all of our successes. We've done a number of things in the area of our membership support. We're right now very busy preparing for our annual meeting. We will be electing new officers, as you will be doing in July. We will be offering or giving the MLD Award and the Meg McLean Advocacy Award. We have a wonderful keynote speaker, Doug Poland. He's an attorney with Law Forward and Stafford Rosenbaum, and he will be speaking about gerrymandering and some of the legal challenges that we've been involved with in the state of Wisconsin. And then we are just now in the process of hiring a new DEI specialist to help not only the Wisconsin League move further along its transformation journey, but this DEI specialist will be available to support all local leagues in the state of Wisconsin. In the areas of communication and advocacy, with our new communications manager, Morgan Grunau, we have been able to be much more active with regard to providing public statements, testimony during hearings. We have come out in support and opposition to many bills this year. And Morgan's making very significant updates to our website so that users can very quickly get to information that they need about the state league, events, recordings of past events that have been held in your league or other local leagues. We're really trying to make it a much more robust tool. And then finally, in the area of litigation, we had a big win last week on Friday. The Supreme Court, after hearing from over 2,000 Wisconsin citizens to not change the rules with regard to where a redistricting case would be heard, the court in the Wisconsin Supreme Court did rule that they will not be the court of original jurisdiction, that any redistricting case would have to go to a lower court for research and analysis, as would be typical on all cases that would ultimately come to the Supreme Court. We've been obviously preparing for what will probably be the legal challenges to some of these voter suppression bills that are marching through the legislature. And we are still waiting to see if there's any court decision that will come on the Fabic case that was a challenge to the use of drop boxes and a clerk's ability to complete incomplete information on an absentee ballot having to do with a witness address or something of that nature. And so we're hopeful that all of these efforts combined continue to help the Wisconsin League and all the leagues across the state really demonstrate that we are a force to be reckoned with. We are making significant impact in the areas of voting rights, in the areas of environmental protection, in healthcare. And I'm just very proud to be a part of all of this and very thankful for everything that you do. If there's a time, I'll take a few questions or not, depending on how that goes.
You've got time for a question. I don't see anybody posing questions, however. So guess you all know how to get a hold of Debra, and you all know how to reach the State League.
Yep.
So I'm going to thank Debra for the update and for her work with the League, as well as her staff. And we'll move on to our next speaker. So we have tonight Jordan Ellenberg, who has agreed to give us a presentation on mathematics and gerrymandering, as I understand it. And I'll give him a brief introduction and then he can speak for himself. Jordan Ellenberg is a number theorist, University of Wisconsin professor of mathematics and author. His popular articles about mathematics have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Wired, and Slate. He was one of 11 mathematicians filing the first ever mathematician's brief in the US Supreme Court gerrymandering case Rucho v. Common Cause. Professor Ellenberg also authored several books, including a bestseller titled How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking. His latest book is Shape, The Hidden Geometry of Information, Biology, Strategy, Democracy, and Everything Else. So thank you for coming, and I'll turn the mic over to you. And I'm going to mute.
Awesome, thank you so much. Now, do I already have the power to share my screen? It looks like I do. So I'm going to do this, and then tell me how this looks. Are you guys seeing my my slides? And if I put it in a slideshow, how does this look?
That looks
Everybody
good.
seeing the title? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so thank you guys so much for having me come tonight. And yes, as was said, like the part of the subtitle of the book, right? It's the geometry of this thing, that thing, the other thing, democracy. And what that's referring to is exactly what I'm going to talk about tonight, something that I know has been an issue for many of you. Gerrymandering, and especially in the book, I focus the most on the assembly district maps right here in Wisconsin, because living here and being a Wisconsin voter, it's a very dramatic example of gerrymandering, and one that I know very well. But of course, this is a national issue. It just happens to be one where our own state is a flashpoint. And you know, there's a lot of talk about the political and legal aspects, but there is a key mathematical aspect too, and that's what I want to talk about tonight, which is maybe a little bit not as much discussed. So, okay, here's our assembly districts. And figuring out how these districts should or shouldn't be drawn, as you can imagine, is a complicated process and a complicated question. And what we do in math when we want to understand something that's like too complicated for us to understand is we replace the problem with something a little bit simpler so that we can hope to understand what its features are. So let me show you how we do that in this case. We're going to imagine a state much simpler than Wisconsin, a state let's call Crayola, where there's only 100 voters and there's only two political parties, the purple party and the orange party. And in this state, this is not a swing state like Wisconsin. This is actually a state where 60% of the population favors the purple party and only 40% favors orange. And let's furthermore say that in this state, just to make things even simpler still, there's not 99 different districts you got to break the state up into. There's only 5. So what I want to show you on the next slide is a bunch of different ways we could break up this state. Oh, I renamed the state inadvertently from one slide to the next, but that's okay. So let's just sort of walk through what's on this slide. In number 1, you have 3 districts that are absolutely dominated by the purple party, 15 purple voters to only 5 orange voters. So that would be 75% purple. And then there's 2 other districts, which are majority orange, but not by as much. They're not as orange as the purple districts are purple. That's one side of the coin. The opposite extreme, if we look at this 4th option, there each district looks exactly like the state. So this is like, you have to imagine if the purple and the orange voters were distributed completely independently of geography, then just as the state is 60% purple, maybe each district would be 60% purple. And there's 2 other possibilities, which there's many, many more possibilities than these. You happen to be 4 representative ones that I've chosen to talk about to make a point. But these give very different results in the legislature. As we can see in this first districting, as I said, there's 3 purple districts and 2 orange districts. In the last one, every single district is 60-40 in favor of purple. And so the orange party, which has a substantial share of popular support, is absolutely zeroed out in the legislature with no seats at all. In this districting 3, I sort of made the numbers. You can, if you feel like it, you can add them up yourself and see that I haven't cooked the books. Like, it adds up to 60 purples and 40 oranges in each case. You end up with 4 purple districts and 1 purple district. And then here in District 2, which I want us to pay special attention to, even though purple has 60% of the vote, their voters are absolutely smashed into these two extremely purple districts at the bottom of the chart, the one with 17-3 and 16-4. So much so that actually orange wins the other three districts by a narrow 11-9 or 55-45 margin. And so in this districting, despite purple having a rather sizable popular majority, they actually are the minority party in the legislature with 3 orange seats and 2 purple seats. So one question here I like to stop and actually ask, because this is sort of the key issue that we have to think about before we go forward. Of these 4 options that I've shown you, which one is the most fair and which is the least? So let's actually literally take a minute. That's what I always do in class. It's good to sort of take a break from the sound of my voice for a minute and actually think. Think about what's your answer to that question. Which is the most fair and which is the least? And then we'll come back and talk about it. And I will make sure I can see the chat so that if people want to, don't type anything yet, because I don't want to prejudice people. So, but after our minute, then we can sort of type stuff into the chat and then talk about it. Okay, now we can chat. You can type in the chat, or if you want to unmute and just say something, I can hear your voice. That's fine too. Yeah, so Rebecca makes a good point that there's lots of aspects of these districts I haven't talked about. For instance, are these districts contiguous, or are they broken up into different pieces? Well, here in Wisconsin, districts actually are required to be contiguous. So that's not true in every state, but it's true here. But let's posit that all 4 of these are made up of districts which are nice and contiguous. Yeah, so I see one person who sort of sticks up for D1 as the most fair, but says that Wisconsin is D2. We'll get to that. And Nona is pointing out that in districting 1, you have a 60-40 split in the population and a 60-40 split of the seats. That's a principle called proportional representation, which a lot of people like. Which one do you think is the least fair out of these? This often generates a bit of controversy. And again, feel free to unmute if you want everybody to hear your voice.
I have a question.
Sure.
The question is, or the comment is that fair is not the standard that we should use to determine how to run legislative elections. That should be, is the election result in representation of the people? It's not whether it's fair, whether it is results in proportional representation of the voters.
Well, so I think you're absolutely right that I had to pick some word, and fair is a word that many people like. There's an organization called Fair Maps, but you're right that there's some sense in which the thing we are actually trying to do here is have representatives who are representative. So I'm with you on this. It might have been better to sort of say which is most, quote, representative.
Okay, I guess one other comment I would like to make is that the problem is not with how boundaries are drawn for single seat districts. The problem is single seat districts themselves, and that what we should have is at-large elections for all 5 of the candidates in this case, and with ranked choice voting. So the problem is single seat districts cannot possibly result in the people selecting their representatives. The representatives are basically selected by 2 things: who the party chooses to run in each party, and the other thing is how the boundaries are drawn around you. What box am I in?
Yeah, so actually, a really important context for all of this is exactly what you say. Most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is incremental in nature, saying how can we, within the current system of voting that we have, make it as representative as possible. But certainly one point of view is that you just can't do that much with the existing system, and that it has to be burned down and replaced with something else. Now, I'm going to argue, and I'm even going to show you a chart that makes the point that says that I think even within the basic setup of single member districts that we have, there can be big differences in representativeness. So I'm going to just stand up for the position that there are a lot of improvements we can make within the current system. But whether you think that's enough is another question, and it's a very reasonable thing to say that it's not. In fact, something, I'm going off on a tangent here, but something I would love to talk about that maybe people in the room from LWV work know about better than me is what happens to all this if this proposed reform passes with the open primaries and ranked choice voting, which is something that I didn't really realize had a political chance in Wisconsin, but it actually sounds like there's a certain amount of bipartisan support for this. And, you know, I'm sure there's people in the room who know the ins and outs of the legislature better than me and know whether this actually has a chance of, this kind of reform has a chance of coming to pass in Wisconsin. But everything I'm talking about tonight, absolutely want to be honest about this, is within the current system where we don't have ranked choice voting, third parties don't play a significant role, and in each district where there's two candidates, there's going to be a Democrat and a Republican who take on the majority of the votes, as in my simple example here. So let me be honest about, that's the context in which we're talking tonight. That's the context in which our politics currently takes place. But we should always have our eyes open to a wider range of options. Okay.
Thank you.
So I would say that, absolutely. So the two that people really dislike on this chart are number 2 and number 4. Usually there's some people think 2 is the worst and some people think that 4 is the worst. And they each have something particularly obnoxious about them. In number 4, what's obnoxious is that one party has been completely shut out from the process of legislation. And I think most people feel there's something wrong with that if there's like a substantial portion of the population that supports this party, they shouldn't be completely voiceless in the legislature. And then of course, the problem with districting 2 is that the party that is popular with the majority of the population is in the minority of the legislature. And as we've seen, there are political conditions, and I think we'd all agree we're living under them now, in which there is not a lot of cooperation between parties, and the party that's in the majority essentially has its will in the legislature without really having to capture a lot of votes from the other side. So I just want to say a little bit, and I'm not going to give a long talk tonight, by the way, and I want there to be space for people to jump in and chat. Just talk a little bit about how in modern terms we assess this. But maybe before I do that, I want to say one more thing about this table. How does this actually work? Districting 2. How is it that the Purple Party does so poorly in legislative seats when they did so well in the popular vote? And the answer is the fact that I already mentioned, that their votes are packed. Their votes are packed into these 2 districts where they absolutely predominate. And so there's just not that, even though there's so many purple votes overall, they're all being used in a minority of districts, leaving a majority of districts where orange has a slight advantage. And that's the fundamental principle of gerrymandering. Like when gerrymandering works, it always works like this. If you're in charge, you draw the lines to pack your opponent's voters into a few districts where they absolutely swamp your team, but then they're used up. So one myth about gerrymandering that I think it's really important to dispel is that gerrymandering is done by drawing these very crazy looking copulating octopus-like districts. So somebody mentioned contiguity in the chat. Districts in Wisconsin have to be contiguous, but beyond that, there's not so many restrictions on what they can look like. There's a curious sentence in our state constitution that says they should be as compact as is practicable. Okay, what does that mean? Like nobody knows, right? So if you draw a district that nobody likes, you can just say, well, it wasn't practicable practicable to make it any better. It's like a sort of words without precise meaning. So that being said, I want to emphasize that our district maps, which are extremely gerrymandered, are not done by making crazy looking districts. So what you're looking at here is actually the 2000 map of the assembly districts around Milwaukee. And what you're looking at here are the maps that were drawn in 2011, the highly gerrymandered maps drawn by the new Republican majority in the legislature and signed into law by the new Republican governor, Scott Walker. And I don't think you could look at these two maps and say the districts have crazier shapes here than here. In fact, if anything, you might even argue that the shapes here are like a little bit nicer looking. So one thing I wonder is, is there anything you do notice about the difference? I mean, they're pretty different, right? But is there anything you notice about the difference between these two maps that kind of jumps out at you? I'm curious how much this is visible. And again, I took myself off of being able to see the chat. There it is. Oh, so nothing new in the chat, but feel free to either type there or say something you notice. So do you guys see this this vertical line on this map? And do we know our Wisconsin geography well enough to know what this line is? Sheboygan County is not on the map, but yeah, what you see on the right here, this is Milwaukee, or more precisely, Milwaukee County. Everything to the right of this line. And this line is the boundary between Milwaukee County and Waukesha County, which, as we know, is a very sharp political boundary here in Wisconsin. I mean, I don't know if you ever I guess when I'm driving from Madison and going to a Brewers game, if it's like September and October in an election year, you're driving to Miller Park and you cross this line, and it is amazing, right? The political signs, they go from Democratic to Republican. Like literally you cross this, I think it's 124th Street where you cross, and they just snap into place. And if you look at these district lines that we had until 2011, you see that the boundaries of the districts really line up very nicely along the county boundary. And that's one of what's called a traditional district criteria here in Wisconsin. And in fact, it's also in the Constitution that you're not really supposed to let assembly districts cross county lines unless you have to. Now let's look at the new maps, the maps we have now, the current districts. Now what's happened? This county line, which used to be dividing between different assembly districts, now there's all these new districts that cross it. And if you see what they've done, they've created districts that are mostly in Waukesha County, but dip into Milwaukee County. So taking some of those Democratic voters and mixing them into what otherwise would be Republican districts, but not enough of them to make a majority. So these districts were drawn to not be competitive for Democrats. But what that leaves of Milwaukee County is much smaller. So I don't have this number in my head, but the number of districts contained within Milwaukee County, these heavily Democratic districts, went down from, I think, around 18 to around 11 on this new map. So these districts don't have a funny shape. They look pretty nice and rectangular, but they are engineered to create more Republican and fewer Democratic seats. Absolutely, this is a process called cracking, as Ann points out in the chat. So the one myth I want to dispel is gerrymandering is funny looking districts. You can't see this with the naked eye, understanding what's wrong with it. Like you got to see the results and analyze them. Okay. Here's another myth I want to dispel. So this is a very, very widely shared statistic from the 2018 election here in Wisconsin. And the tweet I'm showing you it was on the Rachel Maddow show from MSNBC. So this was seen by millions of people saying like, hey, look, in the state of Wisconsin in 2018, 53% of votes in assembly elections went to Democratic candidates, and as against only 45% to Republicans, but 64% of the seats went to Republicans and 36% to Democrats. Of course, here in Wisconsin, we know there's 99 seats, so we know it's like 63-36, but they have to make it percentages for the national media who doesn't understand that we have 99, not 100 districts. So one thing I want to say is this is not how you measure gerrymandering. In fact, this is not even a problem. It's a very effective PR move to combat gerrymandering, but this is not the issue. For one thing, 2018, as you may remember, was a year where Democratic voters were extremely energized, and there was a sense that the mood in the state and the country was very Democratic. And so as a result, there were lots of districts, I don't remember the exact number, but it was certainly in the double digits, where Republicans didn't even field a candidate. Districts where ordinarily Republicans would run somebody and they would probably lose, but like, why not take a chance? And they would get a certain amount of votes, right? Because in most districts in this state, there's like a decent number of Democrats and a decent number of Republicans. Okay, in 2018, everybody who was in that position was like, this is not the year to do this. Like, maybe I'll try again in 2020 when the mood is a little better for my guys. Like, I'm not going to do it this year. And so when you look at this popular vote, this is not a very meaningful statistic. The fact that 53% of the votes went for Democrats represents the fact that a lot of Republicans in Wisconsin simply did not have a candidate of their party to vote for in the assembly election. And so they did not vote. I mean, maybe they showed up and voted for a governor, but they didn't vote down ballot. So the idea that the proportion of seats won should be equal to the proportion of the popular vote is very appealing. And there are electoral systems. So while we're trying to like have an open mind about different systems, there are electoral systems where that's enforced, but it's not enforced in the US system. And even in areas which are not gerrymandering, it's not what you see. A very well-known example is the state of Massachusetts, where, you know, Massachusetts is a pretty democratic state, as you might know, but there's about 30% of the state is Republican. Are 30% of their representatives in the US House Republican? No. You know what percent are Republicans? 0. You know what percent it's been for the last 20 years? Like, also 0. And that's not because there's massive gerrymandering of those House districts. In other Democratic states, by the way, like Maryland, there definitely is, but Massachusetts doesn't happen to be one of them. It's just because Massachusetts is a pretty, is a sufficiently Democratic state that there just aren't really Republican parts of Massachusetts. Things are spread out roughly homogeneously, like in Districting 4. So it's not because of gerrymandering. It's like basically natural that there are no Republican Congress people. In the same way that if you look at like the state legislature of a state like Wyoming, it's not like Wyoming has no Democrats. Probably about 30, again, similarly, about 30% of that state are Democrats. If I remember correctly, I think the legislature is something like 27-3 Republicans and Democrats. And again, that's not because of gerrymandering. There's nothing artificial about that. It's just that typically those numbers are going to be different. I'm just waving to our wonderful Chancellor, Becky Blank, who just walked by. I'm broadcasting from my porch, so that means that there's people come by. Oh, okay, so this is, now I'm gonna, ready, now comes the chart portion of the presentation, but there's just 2, don't worry. There's not gonna be a lot of charts. What on earth are we looking at here? I'm just going to give you the briefest possible depiction of if what we're looking for is not that the proportion of seats should be equal to the proportion of votes. What are we looking for? Well, what we really want to know is, when we want to know if this districting is doing what it's supposed to be doing, one way to think of it is like this. What if there hadn't been gerrymandering? What if a neutral party had drawn these districts, for a state like Iowa, a panel of retired judges, or like Michigan, where there's now a People's Electoral Commission? What if we had had that? What would the map have looked like? How many seats would the Democrats have won, and how many seats would the Republicans have won? Well, that may seem like, yeah, it'd be nice to know that, but that's not what happened. So how are we going to know? You're asking about the alternate universe. Well, there's kind of a very cool way to actually figure out the answer to that question. And that's, you get somebody who's not biased to draw maps, look at how people voted in those wards, making up the districts in those maps, and see how the assembly would have come out. Okay, where are you going to find somebody who's biased? Isn't everybody biased in some way or the other? Well, here's the trick of it. It's not a person, it's a computer. A computer you can program to draw maps in a random way. And it is not biased in favor of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party unless you program it to be, so you don't. You just ask it to produce maps at random. And what's cool is that the computers are pretty fast, like a lot faster than us. So you can make it make a few thousand maps at random. I think what you're looking at here, this is the result of a paper by 3 colleagues of mine at Duke. They made about 14,000 maps of the state of Wisconsin, produced randomly without partisan bias. And then what they did is they said, we're going to look, this particular example is about the 2012 assembly election. And they said, for every one of those maps, we know which wards are in it. So look at how people in that ward voted and say how many of the assembly districts in our map would have been Republican and how many Democratic. And what you see here is something that happens so often in this kind of statistical analysis, which is the so-called bell curve. This very nice curve where if you do this analysis out of their 14,000 maps that they made, a lot of them had exactly 55 Republican seats, a little over 20%. That's what the 0.2 means. And then 54 and 56 were also pretty common, not much less common than that. And in fact, those 3 outcomes together make up around half of all the 14,000 maps that they tried. So basically what they're saying is, if you ask some nonpartisan entity, whether it be a panel of retired judges or the computer on your desk, to draw the maps, under the political conditions that held sway in Wisconsin in 2012, you are probably going to be looking at somewhere between, let's be conservative and say maybe somewhere between like 53 and 57 Republican seats. And this is in a year where, where a Democratic presidential candidate won Wisconsin, but not by as much as he did in 2008, and where the vote in the assembly was actually like pretty even. So one thing I do want to point out is that in Wisconsin, this business about like there being districts where one party absolutely predominates and swamps the other, that's real. That happens without gerrymandering. I live in one of them here in Madison. So those districts, and it does, to be quite honest, like give Republicans an advantage in the assembly. I think that all this analysis shows is that in a condition where the voters statewide were split half and half, Republicans would very likely hold an assembly majority precisely because of the concentration of Democratic voters here in Madison and also in Milwaukee. But it would be on the order of maybe a 55, 54, 56 seat majority. Well, that's not actually what happened. So if you look at this little arrow with a WI from it, that's the actual outcome of the 2012 election, which led to 60 Republican seats. And from the very low height of this bar, what that's telling you is very, very seldom in their computer simulations did the computer ever come out with a map that was as favorable to Republicans as the map that was actually drawn. In other words, this is kind of the smoking gun when the real map is like way out here on the edge of this distribution, saying like, if this was done by a neutral party, no way it would have come out this favorable to one party or the other. It's what's called an outlier. And this is the analysis that the mathematician's brief presented to the Supreme Court, and what the plaintiffs asked the Supreme Court to take into account in this case that adjudicated, well, not our maps, but the maps in North Carolina and Maryland. Let me show you one more chart, and this is the last one, and then we're basically at the end. Oops, go back. I didn't label these, but what you are looking at here is every election, every statewide election held in Wisconsin between the year 2002 and 2018. And the x-axis, what you see, the horizontal axis here, is how much of the popular vote went to the Republican candidate. And the vertical axis is in how many assembly districts the Republican candidate got more votes than the Democratic candidate. And then finally, you may say like, well, wait, why are there circles and stars? Well, the circles represent all the votes taken under the old map, under the map that was in sway from 2002 to 2010. The stars are the map that we have now, the new map. And this, to me, makes it absolutely crystal clear and visible just how powerful these new maps are, because what you need to see is that the stars are floating above the circles. If you look at elections where like this circle here, actually, can you see my cursor when I move it, or can you guys not see that? I don't know if I have the capacity to
We can
point.
see your cursor. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so and just as you went away, oh, there it is. Right, so an election like this where Republicans got only 46, 47% of the vote, under the old map led to a minority of legislative seats with that candidate the winner. The same political statewide conditions under the new map, which is the stars, lead to the Republican winning in well over 50%, which is to say well over 50 of the assembly districts. So it's very visible here by the relation of the stars to the circles that the new maps give the Republicans a very, very big advantage over what they had under the maps before, which were drawn by a court, which is reasonably neutrally. Those maps were drawn actually, the maps ended up in court, and then the Democrats submitted a proposed map and the Republicans submitted a proposed map, and other sort of groups, each one of which their partisan affiliations, submitted various maps, and the court looked at them and were like, well, we were gonna choose among the ones we got, but they were all so dirty that we're throwing them all out and drawing our own map. And that's how we got this map that was in force between 2002 and 2010. But also this chart shows you something really interesting about our particular maps. I would love to see if this pattern replicates in other states, which is that it's not over the whole range of possible outcomes where the circles and the stars are different. Up in the right half, they're not actually that different. What it shows you is the following. These maps that we have are designed in a very specific way. They're not designed to always give Republicans advantage. In a situation that's a good year for Republicans, where Republicans are drawing 52, 53% of the statewide vote, actually the new maps behave pretty much the same way the old maps did. What these maps are designed to do is to kick in precisely when the winds shift in favor of Democrats. In a situation where Democrats are winning a majority of the statewide vote, unless it's absolutely a dominant majority, the action of these maps then kicks in and preserves the Republican majority, keeping it over this 50% of the seats line. And by doing so, I mean, in some sense, it's like wasted to have your map do a lot of work like up here in this zone, because the Republicans are already going to win. You want to sort of save your powder and use it down here. And that's exactly what these maps, I mean, it's a nice piece of engineering. You can't deny it. You have to kind of be impressed when you look at like how carefully it was designed. But you also get a little nauseous, right? So, I mean, let's just close by talking about what comes next. So, we've had this Supreme Court case where the US Supreme Court has said loud and clear, we are not going to step in here. And by the way, it's interesting. They didn't say that it's constitutional to do this. They said it's non-justiciable, which is a technical legal term. And what it means is it might be constitutional and it might not, but we are not allowed to sort of step in and do anything about it. It's actually, I mean, Justice Roberts' decision in this case, he doesn't try to pretend. I mean, the people defending these gerrymandered maps kind of went to the Supreme Court and were like, well, really, this is okay. Really, there's nothing dirty about this. Like, really, how do you even know that gerrymandered maps are doing anything? Like, why does everybody think it's such a big deal? That point of view is decisively rejected. I mean, in the majority opinion saying the Supreme Court wasn't going to act, John Roberts called this incompatible with democratic principles. But basically saying this is super dirty and undemocratic, but we can't do anything about it. In fact, he kind of expresses I'm going to be honest with you, I wouldn't say this in print, kind of pathetic. He was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and saying, like, I really hope somebody else does something about it. This is like really bad. I'm not going to do anything about it. We're not going to do anything about it, but it would be great if somebody else was. He's like, maybe state Supreme Courts could do something. Maybe some legislation could get passed somehow. Like maybe there could be a ballot referendum, not here in Wisconsin, right? He didn't mention that many states don't allow ballot referenda unless initiated by the legislature, the very party that's enacting the gerrymandering in the first place. But he clearly is asking for somebody, anybody other than him and his 8 pals, to come and do something about this thing that he cannot even pretend is democratic or ethical. So, we're going to see some of this. this is the answer to what comes next, and it has already begun. As you mentioned, we just had this case where certain actors in the state tried to circumvent the entire process and say we don't want other courts to get a look at our maps, like happened in 2000. We certainly would just hand it right to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, as I'm probably going to use this legal term wrong, the court of original jurisdiction. Is that the right phrase? Anyway, this was slapped down by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They're like, come on, we're not going to change the rules when the game is about to start. But there is going to be a lot of this. And one thing I want to emphasize, because I feel like when I give this talk, it always sounds like I'm, especially after the Supreme Court's decision, it always sounds like I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic. But no, because something really good has happened, which is that partially because of the publicity around the Supreme Court decision, but crucially, in large part because of civil society groups like the League of Women Voters, like the people here in this room, people are learning more and more about what gerrymandering is, how it works, and just how powerful it is. And I think that is something that people have not been that aware of up to the last. I think people knew the word, but the absolute scale and the absolute sort of extent to which this really subverts democratic, I think, it's just gotten much, much bigger in the public eye. And, I hope that by writing articles and writing books that talk about this a lot, I'm part of it. John Oliver did a whole 20-minute special on it on his show, so he's part of it. I mean, we're all going to be part of it, because I got to tell you, here's one thing I've seen happening politically. When people find out what this is, they don't like it. Right? People get that this is dirty. And that's true of Democrats and it's true of Republicans. It is not a partisan thing. I don't even know the exact number, but the number of counties here in Wisconsin that have passed resolutions asking for a different kind of maps, asking for non-gerrymandered maps. I think it's now up to 55 out of our counties. And that includes, red counties and blue counties, densely populated counties and rural counties. I mean, nobody is willing to stand up for this practice, even the people who do it. And again, that is Republicans here in Wisconsin, but it's Democrats in other states like Maryland. I mean, Steny Hoyer, who is the third ranking person in the entire House of Representatives, he described himself as a serial gerrymanderer. I think a lot of people who've been in politics for a long time, I mean, do it. But if you really press them, their defense is just like, well, we're allowed to, so we do. Not this is okay, or not this is compatible with democracy, but we're allowed to, so we do. Well, I think we're all working towards creating conditions under which that becomes harder and harder to get away with. And I don't think we have to I don't think we as civically active citizens of the state of Wisconsin, or wherever, I saw somebody's in from Minnesota, or wherever we happen to be, I don't think they may say, we're allowed to do it, so we do. We don't have to settle for, you're allowed to do it, so you can. So I'll stop there. And I'm very happy to take questions, because this is a topic I care about a lot.
Thank you very much. I hope we do have some questions here. So please just unmute yourselves and speak up.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Yes, Rebecca.
Sure. Is that Rebecca Clark? Okay.
It is, yeah. And can we stop screen sharing? I like to see faces.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Thank you for reminding me.
That's all right. That's all good. I just wanted to follow up on the Massachusetts thing you said. I took some notes. That's kind of interesting. Massachusetts it has Democratic representation on the national level, but it's not gerrymandered. But because there aren't pockets of Republican or Dem, so how would you, is that kind of what you were saying? Like it would be hard to crack or pack?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think, and so I would say there's nobody who thinks that there's anything dirty about the fact that there's no Republican Congress people from Massachusetts, just as people don't really think it's dirty that there's only 3 Democratic state legislators in Wyoming. When you have a state that is tilted pretty far in one direction or the other, so like a real life state that's 60-40 in favor of one party, a district would have to be very different from this state in order for it to be possible for the minority party to win there. And that's kind of what we see. But of course, those are not the political conditions in Wisconsin, right? Wisconsin is not a state that's dominated by one party. If we were having this discussion in one of the Dakotas, the issues, I mean, the issues might be the same issues, but the outcomes would look very different. So, I'm probably biased because I live here to really having thought a lot about how it plays out in a state where the electorate is very closely split.
And Jordan, one other question, and then I'll shut up.
No, please, that's what I'm here to do. It's really nice out. I'm sitting on my porch. I mean, I'll sit here till it gets dark.
Outside too. I'm loving this. But didn't the Supreme Court find that some jurisdictions within some states were a little wonky? I think weren't some Milwaukee districts and some districts, was it Virginia or some other places that they were like, okay, you guys, that's weird. It's too much.
So what happened is, so with the map that we have now, you're absolutely right. There was a federal court that threw out some of the districts in Milwaukee, saying these districts were clearly drawn to keep Latino voters in Milwaukee from having a Latino representative. So this subject has many tendrils. And so one thing, and I don't talk about it in the book either, because it's like a very complicated area of law that I have a PhD in math, like there's only so much law I can do. So the issue of racial gerrymandering is built on a completely different legal chassis, and the standards are different. And so it's definitely part of the story. And so to be precise, what I'm talking about here tonight is partisan gerrymandering to aid or hurt a specific political party. The issue, courts have been much more willing to step in to stop racial gerrymandering, because there's much more of a body of case law that says, like, hey, you're not allowed to deprive members of a certain race of their political rights. The question of whether you're allowed to deprive members of a certain political party of their political rights is much more constitutionally complicated, and courts have been locked to jump in. I mean, and I think, with some reason, I don't think, let me put it this way, let's say you're a member of a third party. You don't really want there to be a constitutional principle. Democrats as a group have like rights that have to be protected, and Republicans do too. Like that there is a reason that it's treated differently.
I thought it was really interesting. I was reading about Melissa's presentation. Some people wrote up, they're frustrated because they're divided in a watershed. So they're like a little sliver of it, but they're not getting the same representation. So there's so many things here that divide into it. It's really interesting, Jordan. Thanks for your yeah.
And I should have said, like, one thing that's happening here that I strongly support is, in Michigan, they have a People's Commission that's actually drawing the map. Here in Wisconsin, we also have a People's Commission that Governor Evers created that has no legal power whatsoever, but I think it's very wise to actually let them do the work so that we can see there's an alternative. The alternative, a legal way to enforce it, but we can at least see what it would look like if just a group of regular Wisconsin citizens who are not partisan activists, who actually do these round tables around the state and listen to people say things just like the thing that you said. And so I testified at one of these meetings and then stayed and listened to the question and answer period. And, people have real opinions about what it means for them to be represented that are very local. And like, good God, like, why do we not have a system where those people, the people who are supposed to be represented are listened to when they say, what would it mean for me to be represented? Instead, I can tell you right now what's going to happen. There's going to be a locked room in a law firm in Madison where a group of people whose only job is to be a partisan activist draw these maps, and then it's voted on a party line vote in the legislature without any input from the public.
And we pay for that, and we're paying for that. So yay!
And we're paying for it. But honestly, that's the least of the problem. I mean, honestly, that's like that's right.
My
and
turn?
again, by the way, I'm sorry.
Yeah, John Binder from Plymouth here. I was reading a review of your new book, and they did a review of the chapter that's titled "How Math Broke Democracy and Still Might Save It." Math might still save it. And I wonder how familiar you are with the Iowa model for redistricting. Are they using the right kind of math to save democracy?
I'm not an expert in it, but I think there they use a panel of retired judges. Is that right? I think that's who does it in Iowa. Is that correct?
Mhm.
So here's the good news. The good news is that we somehow have settled on the absolute worst possible system. So anything else, like any other way that anybody does it, if you say, is that better? I'm like, yep, that would be better, because we literally almost couldn't be worse than what we have. So are what those judges doing in some sense mathematically perfect? No, but I don't really think there's such a thing as mathematical perfection in redistricting. It's not a mathematical problem. It has math in it, but it's a human problem, a political problem. One thing I compare it to in the book. So by the way, the section in the book, it's like 70 pages of the book. So if your only issue with this talk was like it was way too short, I want to spend way more time hearing Ellenberg talk about this. That in the book, I promise, like it's much more detailed than what I give here. Although that picture isn't it that I showed you. So what I've learned after thinking about this a lot is like it's very hard to define fair. It's very hard to define representative, but it's not that hard to define unfair and unrepresentative. And what we have now, the violations are so egregious that they're really pretty easy to see. We don't have to eliminate gerrymandering. We probably can't. To make gerrymandering to zero, what would that even mean? What we have right now is it's the same way that you can't stop shoplifting, right? If you run a store, okay, people are going to shoplift, but you don't leave like a giant jar of the most expensive candy you have like right by the door, right? You're asking for trouble, and that's what we've done. And I think that we could do a lot, honestly. We don't have to make it perfect. We don't have to take gerrymandering to zero. If we could just, and I'm just like wishful thinking, if the Supreme Court had just, but they didn't, but if we could, in other ways, just blunt the worst of the offenses, just because right now it's so advantageous to a political party to do it. I mean, you read these memos that were released in the depositions about what the Republican operatives were saying, and I got to be honest, I feel a little sympathy with them. I get it, because they're in this position where it's their job to promote their interests in their party, and they're like, boy, if what they said, and this is a quote, they're like, this is an opportunity we're not going to have again, and it's our obligation to take advantage of it. They're basically saying just saying, we're letting you seize a permanent majority. How can we not do it? We would be like not doing our jobs if we didn't do this thing we've been given the opportunity to do. Just make it harder.
Yeah,
That's
but
all I'm saying.
how do we get rid of it since they've got permanent majorities? I mean, it's ridiculous. I don't know how we get out of it.
Well, I think that if the system holds, one way around it is to elect a governor of a different party, and that is what we've done. And historically in Wisconsin, it's not that common for both houses of the legislature and the governorship to all be held by the same party. So what has happened, I think, for the last 3 cycles before this most recent one, was that all three couldn't agree on the map. So there was not a map that could be passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And so it went to the court, and the court sort of do the messy work of hashing out some kind of compromise that we put in place. And is that perfect? No, but is it a lot better than just like handing the keys to the car to like the drunk 16-and-a-half-year-old? Like, yes, much better than that. And I honestly, that is my hope, is that what will happen again in Wisconsin in this next cycle is what has happened before. And maybe I'm being too optimistic. I don't know what you guys think we're involved in this case, but I do sort of slightly see this unanimous decision by our Supreme Court as some evidence that that's going to happen, that they're like, come on, guys, we have a system. So I'm somewhat hopeful about that for our state right now, but that's only one. I mean, to say one other thing, because I think it was Roberta who brought up Virginia. Again, I want to emphasize the bipartisan nature of this problem. Virginia, they passed like a ballot referendum saying we're going to create a nonpartisan commission to do the lines. That was a very heavily Republican gerrymandered state like Wisconsin. Well, something interesting happened there. Virginia has moved towards Democrats so swiftly. The political composition of that state is changing a lot. Even under the highly gerrymandered maps, Virginia just stopped being a swing state. It became a Democratic state because of population growth in the northern part of the state. And and Democrats took the majority in this critical census year. And guess what happened? Those Democrats who had been so fervently fighting for reform of the gerrymandering system, the second they had the keys, then they were like, well, maybe we're not so sure about this after all. You know, I mean, it's really embarrassing. I'm sorry, but that's how it is. And
I think one thing that, sorry, I'm sorry, I thought you were finished.
no, you guys jump in, whatever, because I can just go and go
So,
and go.
I mean, I think one thing that people sometimes lose sight of is that, you know, when you're gerrymandered, that also locks in the minority candidates. It locks in incumbency. So the people who are packed into their, you know, into their fewer districts, those representatives are just as bulletproof as the party that's in power. And so, you know, you talk about how it's a bipartisan issue to get rid of gerrymandering, and you're looking at it from the standpoint of, you know, let's just take Wisconsin, you know, the Republicans who are frustrated at being in majority Democrat districts where they have no hope of ever, you know, casting out that Democrat. But you have to also think about what that means as a Democrat, because how do you know that the Democrats that you do have in power are acting in the interest of the party, and the party eventually, you know, hopefully, God willing, you know, retaking a majority, rather than simply locking in their incumbency in their own fortune, because they're basically having to make their districts more competitive. And will they do that?
Yep.
You know, I mean,
So right, and incumbency is a really big part of this story. You're absolutely right that there can be an unholy alliance between legislators who are like, okay, I'm content to be in the majority forever as long as I don't have to do the work of like raising money and going and campaigning in my district. Hey, my life's pretty easy if I've been stuffed into it. I'm not in, by the way, I do not have any particular person in mind. I'm sort of saying this in the abstract, but you can see how it could work, right? Where,
yeah.
Okay, I mean, so yes, absolutely. I mean, again, maybe I have some hope. I don't. Again, I would love if people have opinions, because I've just only started learning about it. You know, this proposed.
I would
reform.
agree with that, Jordan, and thanks from the Burton household. Hello.
All right.
What happens is it's frustrating as a candidate running in Sheboygan, where you have candidates in Milwaukee that don't fundraise. They won't help candidates in other areas that maybe don't get as many resources, and that's not helping the team. So because you're comfortable, right? You're completely packed. That's an issue.
I remember a recent election day, I met a candidate from Milwaukee who was up here in Sheboygan, knocking on doors and getting out the vote. You know, not making speeches, not public appearance, nothing like that. He's just burning, I guess I'm giving away his gender, but he was burning shoe leather, because he had nothing to do in Milwaukee, or we're, you know, down south, but in his gerrymandered district, he had no
Where
worry.
was he during the summer? He should have been up here in the summer.
I would think maybe he was. I don't know. I just didn't see him this summer. But I don't know, maybe you know who I'm talking about. I don't know. But I just thought it was quite remarkable that you have somebody outside their own district just doing what they could to help out, because they really had no need to be in their own.
John, did you have a comment on that?
What's that?
John, did you have something to say on that?
Yes, there's something else that's really in play here as far as changing the system. Let me ask Rebecca, what was the percent breakout for your election against Katzma? What percent did he get of the registered voter? What percent did you get?
Which
Remember?
year? Which year?
Well, just pick one. I don't care. Pick a year.
41%.
And he had so he got the majority.
He got 54. Yeah.
What I did is I looked at that district, and I did it for Warpogel's district and for Lemahue's district. Katzma, all right, he won by 54% of the registered voters. I looked at the eligible voters in the district. He won 34% of the eligible. We've got a huge chunk of people that are not voting. And that can make an impact on some of these elections that might be close, that are gerrymandered districts. They are gerrymandered districts. But, and one of the problems we have, gerrymandering causes voters to say, what's the use to vote? So they don't vote. But I think there's some of the gerrymandered districts, even though the incumbent has the upper hand, I think it is close enough that if people would vote, we could change it. If people would just vote. That's my comment.
It's absolutely true. And one thing people ask a lot is like, given that the system has been the same for a long time, why is gerrymandering such a big problem now? And one reason, I'm not going to say it's because of low turnout, because turnout has always been low. And actually, as you probably know, in Wisconsin, turnout is much higher than it is in most of the rest of the country. So, we're very gerrymandered, but we also have very high turnout anyway. Not that it's everybody, but it's, but voting behavior has become very predictable in a way that it didn't used to be. So this is a very robust finding in political science that people used to switch parties like a lot more. They'd vote for a Democrat in one election and a Republican in the next election. That has all but stopped. And also, people who vote a lot keep on voting a lot, and people who don't vote don't become new voters. Except obviously when they turn 18, right? There's new voters coming in when they turn 18, and then there's other old voters sometimes stop being voters because they stop being around. But other than that, it's very, very stable now in a way that it hasn't been at other points in recent American political history. And that's one of the things that makes gerrymandering work so well, that they can look ahead and actually have a pretty idea of how these districts are going to look for the next 10 years. And again, another reason I love ranked choice voting and I love this idea of the open primaries is that I think that anything that makes the vote in this state less predictable is good for fighting gerrymandering, because it just makes it harder to do it effectively. It throws wild cards into the system. And like I said, because I think we have the worst of all possible systems right now, anything that disrupts it, I think is probably to the good.
Can I ask you that question, Jordan, as the math person? It was my understanding there would be no math tonight, but
I'm old enough to get that joke, by the way.
Thank you. I'm kind of wondering if we shouldn't be using less math. I know this kind of came up early in the discussion where we're just doing math by population and voters, because you're right. What happened when they were looking at the boopity doops was who's a consistent voter, what is the age of the voter, how often do they vote. There was a whole different pile of data that was used versus back in the day, it was, okay, well, some more people moved into Sheboygan, so I guess we'll take a chunk out of Kohler and we just move this around. It wasn't based on all these other things that these law firms are bringing into it. If it could just be a blind map, and then the candidate has to meet that map. So, I love natural resources, but I'm gonna have to go to the Chamber of Commerce. You know what I mean? Like, is that part of the Iowa model, John? I don't know. I mean, okay.
I would say it's probably part of our People's Commission model, which again doesn't have legal force, but what they are doing is talking to people. And they are not doing this kind of hardcore data dive because they have no motivation to. The reason you do that is because it works. So if your goal is to sort of like lock in an advantage for your party, then you do that because that's how you accomplish that. But if that's not your goal, then you don't need to do it. Your goal might be to actually listen to people about what their political needs are. So actually, can I ask you, Rebecca? So I didn't realize I picked it up from context. So you've been a candidate for assembly, is that right?
I ran in 2016 and 2018.
So can I don't want to put you on the spot, but can I ask, this idea of having open primaries, which would be a very different look for this state, if I understand correctly, like open primaries and then the top 5 go to the general and then we do ranked choice. As a candidate, do you have any insight into like what would elections look like here and how would they look different if we had that system?
I would love it. Personally, my experience was, and part of this is because the maps are still in 2016 anyway, we're still fairly new. In knocking doors, people didn't know who my opponent was. And then when they found out who he was, they said, well, why is someone from Oostburg representing Sheboygan? And I had to explain, well, the maps are different now. So now we have Oostburg and Random Lake, and they're like, what? You know, I think it would be great because it forces you to get out there on the ground rather than, I think I said this in the chat, I mean, the parties shouldn't be picking the candidates. You know, it should be who is in that community and knows that community and can really, you know, garner some excitement versus this is our boy. And I say boy just because, you know, Sheboygan. Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah,
know,
I would love it.
I mean, look, we invented the primary here in Wisconsin for that exact reason, right? I mean, we're a progressive state, and this was the reform. No more smoke-filled rooms. No, the party just decides. We're going to have the people who are members of that party decide. And then, of course, over the years, it's degenerated into another version of the smoke-filled room. But it's a Wisconsin tradition to kind of do bold things and be like, let's shake this up and run our elections in a different, more democratic way.
I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it vets candidates better than just the parties vetting the candidates. Let the communities vet the candidates would be great.